Hi everyone, it's Chris Cosson here. Welcome to our June Rescom presentation. Today we have presenting to us Dr. Leah Li on the topic of speaking authenticity of social media influences in public affairs. Now, Dr. Li coordinates and teaches courses and researches and supervises PhDs at RMIT University. Her research sits at the nexus of public relations and digital communication. Prior to this current position, she's worked at different universities in Australia and China, including Macquarie University and as an associate professor at Guangzhou University, China. Dr. Li holds a doctoral degree in internal communication and media, awarded at Macquarie University. She serves as an invited reviewer for multiple world-leading Q1 journals. Her recent work can be found in the Public Relations Review, European Journal of Cultural Studies, Global Media and China, and Media International Australia, those sources. This current work is supported with a 2020 Australia-China Joint Action Program, and Dr. Li might talk a little bit about that if it's pertinent. Now, what I'll do before I hand over to Dr. Li is just give a rundown on the abstract to set the scene. So I've said I will do that now, so I shall. Okay, so social media influences arising from individual citizens are growing in a force in shaping perceptions and behaviours through content distribution and generation of content in the digital sphere. Some of these influences play a significant role in channeling public opinion on public affairs through practice of authenticity. This talk unpacks the construct of authenticity within the setting of influences and probes to what extent this allows influencers to generate influence for the purpose of engaging their followers in developing a representative nation brand. This Dr. Li's talk will provide insights into the use of authenticity in the development of strategies for engaging publics through influencers and serves the aim of generating a collaborative response to nation branding initiatives and then onto the wider socio-political issues. So it's an honour to hand over to our presenter, Dr. Li.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So perhaps this is the first time I met Chris and Mandy. So as Chris, you have introduced, I'm Leah Li, also known as Shufang Li, from the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University. So just now, the abstract is about nation branding. And then later on is actually I view nation branding as a part of the subfields of public affairs. So as a result, the talk today, I move it beyond nation branding space. So talk about the authenticity of social media influences in public affairs. Now, I would like to start the context. As we can see here, the purpose of this talk, and also the same as the research projects, is actually to probe the potential of social media influences in public affairs through the lens of authenticity. And nation branding in my research project is setting up as a context for studying this research aim. And the focus of my talk today is we'll discuss the contrast of the authenticity framework that we have developed through this study. So I will focus on talking about how we develop the authenticity framework and how this can be utilized in the practical and theoretical sense. And then if we still have time, then I will introduce the case study using this authenticity framework. And this case study is related to what just now Chris has introduced, the authenticity framework utilized in the social media influencers' role in nation branding space. So our literature review shows that including lots of empirical studies that has already demonstrated that social media influencers has emerged as a new force in shaping public discourse and raising public awareness of social political agendas in the digital public sphere. So maybe some of you are very familiar with the influencers on YouTube. So this group of YouTube influencers that have demonstrated strong attempts to create commentary that critiques social issues, politics, and the state. And this phenomena is conceived of as often representing the voice of marginalized minorities in a society. And this is because they provide an alternative source of information that rival the mainstream media. And as a result, it creates a space and a channel for people to air a reactionary political stance. Therefore, we start with the literature review to look at the definition of social media influencers. So in this study, I will just talk about influencers because it's an abbreviation of social media influencers. So according to this definition, you can see that social media influencers are actually coming from part of the ordinary user groups and on social media. And then what's the difference between social media influencers and ordinary user group is that they have popularity and influence in a social network. And then the way they grow their popularity and influence is actually based on a variety of mechanisms. And one of these mechanisms is the authenticity approach. And at the same time, there are different types of influencers. So the general typologies includes activists, news clippers, opinion leaders, and information influencers. Perhaps the most common form of influencers belong to the information influencers. And therefore, we start to think about why influencers are important and what kind of influence they have. So our literature review shows that the influence of influencers or why they are important is actually because they have the capability of commodifying their fame to induce changes in perceptions and behaviors of an audience through their constant distribution of information, not only information, but also inspiration. So that's very important to know, not just information, but also inspiration. And also, there is a wider agreement that this continuously meaning-making processes through content distribution and generation actually has an impact on public understanding of an issue or the image and reputation of a brand. So that shows that the influence of influencers are actually quite important. And this is why in our study, we want to focus on the role of social media influencers in public affairs. And therefore, we look further how they generate this influence. So it shows that the influencers is actually generated through engagement. So the key engagement stakeholder they have is through their followers. So they engage with the followers based on using the proactive messaging approach. And there are two indicators to measure influencers' influence. The first indicator is reach, And then the second indicator is impact. And it's very important for us to know that reach is different level of reach. So the first level of reach means influencers, they have a large social media followings. But at the same time, they can utilize these large social media followings to trigger a large secondary reach, basically through their followers to reach followers network. So that's the definition of reach. So it's two different levels of reach, and the second level shows the difference between social media influencers and those ordinary internet users. Now, the second important indicator is impact. So they not only be able to reach a large amount of followers, but they also be able to trigger changes and affect the decision-making process of followers. And this actually also has been done by empirical studies in different disciplines like marketing or tourism, and then also public relations. So this definition draws our attention to engagement with followers as a critical component of determining how influence is wielded by influencers on how their followers interpret the world. So in other words, it's an indication that the influence is based on not only the influence generated by the influencers, but more importantly, how this has an impact on their followers. And therefore, influencers, they embrace the mechanism of authenticity to grow their influence in a social network. So the way they generate influence is based on one of the key mechanisms, that is authenticity. So although there are some critical concerns about authenticity becoming a performative and manipulative act for an audience, but we can't really deny that authenticity is very important in generating the influence. And a growing body of research has already unveiled the contrast of influencers' authenticity from the perspective of both influencers and audience members, and also, as well as the relationship between the perceived authenticity of the influencers and the purchase intention of followers. And these sort of studies mainly come from the marketing discipline and tourism discipline. And however, there's very limited attention that has been given to study what means influencers use to engage followers in promoting government initiatives to their followers, and how these link to followers' perception and behaviors towards initiatives. So that's why we feel it's very important to look at how authenticity is formed, and it could be measured and put into operation. And so through our further literature review, we found that authenticity is actually regarded as the core to offer a robust basis to grow engagement between influencers and followers. And here I highlight two different type of or various definitions about authenticity. So in the first one, you can see that there's a transition from intrinsic motivation to external gratification. And when the definition of authenticity first started, it was actually built upon intrinsic motivation, which values uniqueness, original expression, and independence from the market. But gradually, this definition is oriented towards external gratification determined by recognition and reward from others. So from this perspective, you can see that authenticity definition is start to go from one way to two-way construct. And then it starts to have lots of discussion about the ethical perspective of authenticity. So the most important framework that is this one I list here. So it refers to authenticity that should be built upon two ethical dimensions. The first one is being true to one's self and brand. And the second dimension is also need to be being true to one's audience. So that means the influencers, if they want to grow their influence in a sustainable way, they should comply with this ethical framework, not just being responsible for themselves and the brand they sponsor, but also should be responsible for their audience. So that's the way to grow their influence and their followings in a sustainable approach. And however, unauthentic actions actually has consequences. For example, it will result in public backlash. So in other words, if influencers want to continue grow their influence and has an impact, they actually should focus on this sort of two-way construct of authenticity, and because that allow them to build credibility and acquire social and cultural capital on social media. And this is the key contributor to their influence. And therefore, we have another look is the mediator as an audience. So gradually, an audience approach to unpack the authenticity has emerged in the recent literature. So basically, the view is that authenticity, we view it as a social contrast, because on one hand, this is like a perceived authenticity is actually dependent on personal belief and perspective from an audience. So it's not just about how the social media influencers, they want to, how they construct this authenticity kind of messages, but also depends on how the audience interprets that. So it's a two-way construct. And on the other hand, the relational and affective aspects between message receiver and resources are also central to influencers' practice of authenticity. So what this means is that influencers' relationship with different types of stakeholders, like their sponsoring brands, advertising agents, and local or global audiences, can cause the misperception of the influencer's self. And for example, when influencers partnering with marketing firms, they are devoted to crafting an online version of themselves, and that can allow them to achieve higher social capital in an attempt to add value to their status and work. And this focus is to create content that enable them to develop social bonds with their audiences rather than to reflect their personal voice and life. So from that perspective, influencers could, because of be driven by commercial gains, as a result, they may have a sort of engineer type of self, and that is presented on their profile, and their own personal voice could be hidden. So that's a kind of pros and cons of authenticity in a practical sense. And it is at the same time, because we say the influence of influencers is actually on their followers is through engagement. So this brings the connection to the principle of the authentic stakeholder engagement framework. So basically, according to this framework, it means the success of acquiring influence through engaging with an audience in an authentic way need to comply with the principle of the authentic stakeholder engagement framework. For example, based on a two-way communication mechanism featuring ethical, inclusive, and collaborative communication practice with the commitment to acquiring social development. So that means we situate this authenticity practice not just in a mechanical space, but also put it in a broader context that's related to the communication ecosystem. So based on the discussion, we developed this authenticity framework, influencers authenticity framework. So as you can see in this table, there are 6 dimensions that help to contribute to influencers authenticity in the digital space. Excuse me, the first one is content, the first dimension, and the second is creativity, and then the third is self-disclosure, and then the fourth is intrinsic motivation, and the fifth is expression of integrity, and the last one is interactivity. So the definition of each of these dimensions is listed or briefed in this table. And then I would like to highlight content. So later I will introduce a framework that can further unpack content. And then in terms of interactivity, we divide it into another 4 sub-dimensions. The first one is reciprocity, responsiveness, and speed of response, non-verbal information. So altogether, there are 4 sub-dimensions that is put into this interactivity space. So that also leverage the platform, consider the platform interactivity there, not just about how fast the influencers respond to their followers' inquiries or comments. So this is our authenticity framework. Now, as a result, we develop an argument that is influence of influencers is co-created with followers through engagement within an ethical communication mechanism, and authenticity plays a key part in this engagement process. So our key idea is that the influence of influencers are actually co-created with their followers. So that is a kind of community and public focus approach to interpret authenticity. And that is how it aligns with our public relation. So we still have time. So I'm going to quickly introduce this case study. So based on just now that authenticity framework, then we use that to investigate the case of China through the context of sports. So China here is just a case study. And then, so basically we want to look at the role of influencers in government-led nation branding initiative within the context of sports. So specifically, it's like how influencers interpret or communicate this nation branding initiative to the public or ordinary internet users. So as a result, that's a part of a kind of within the scope of public affairs. And then we focus on investigating the way influencers deploy the logic of authenticity to engage followers while navigating the internet ecosystem in China, and also to look at to what degree this contributes to the creation of a brand that represents the voice of the citizens. So, so when we take this case study, we also need to put it into the context of China. Chinese influencers share some common features of influencers that we have just discussed, but they also have some uniqueness. For example, they are sort of expected to have some social impact create some social impact. So this social impact is that they're expected to perform as a role model to set the moral direction of society. And then, for example, like display work ethics, social responsibility, while at the same time make the efforts in promoting the core socialist values imposed by traditional Chinese culture and national goals and social goals, and then align with the individual values of patriotism, dedication, integrity, and friendship. So that's the expectation on Chinese influencers in the specific society in China. And in terms of the current trend, we can see that there is a surge of Chinese influencers functioning as independent agency. They do it for themselves. But at the same time, there are also some influencers partner with government agents and then promote particular social political agendas. So that two different broad type of influences in China. And then in terms of the Chinese web culture and politics, it's interesting. So perhaps most of you are aware of the internet censorship system in China. And then, but these days, there's a new mode, we term it as a hybrid mode of internet censorship. That means the combination of hard and soft approach. And then the hard approach is the one that most of us we know. That's like the Great Firewall, tight internet censorship. But the soft approach is the popular trends now. So that means the government actually allows some degree and have some tolerance of critical speech to circulate on the internet. So that seems to give the users some freedom to express critical views about the government. And at the same time, the government also try to channel the citizens in order to nurture those speech that is in support of government agencies or government goals. So in that case, they try to balance the negative sentiments against the government. So this is what we term it as a non-coercive approach. And as a result, that contributes to the hybrid mode of internet censorship. And because of this communication ecosystem, as a result, the influencers or internet users, they normally, when they express themselves, they will use a mixture of technique like playfulness, human satire, jokes, and that become part of the important Chinese web culture and politics. So this is the kind of background that it's important to investigate the case of China. And in terms of the methodology, we use a mixed method approach. That is the combination of social network analysis and content analysis. And we collect data surrounding these three events, soccer events. And just now I talk about the content. So content is the first dimension of our authenticity framework. So how did we measure contents? So in this study, we measure contents by drawing the three dimensions from the Sports Nation branding framework. So basically, we view a brand is formed by three dimensions: physical attributes, functional attributes, and personality traits. So we did the coding, categorize those posts into these three dimensions and measure how the audience engage with each of those three dimensions, and also how each of those authenticity approaches were utilized to promote each of these dimensions. And here is the finding. I just go through the finding quickly. So from the influencer's perspective, we found that they focus on portraying the physical attributes of the China brand using neutral tone. And so as you can see here, it's not much about positive tone, it's neutral tone. And at the same time, there are some of the influencers actually gave critical views about the government. And then in terms of interactivity between influencers and followers, we found that they were limited to the two dimensions: speed of response, non-verbal information, and there was a lack of regular exchange of opinions. So that's a high level of interactivity, but it was not obvious in these findings. From the followers' perspective, we found that those followers, they responded very well to the authenticity techniques of interactivity, creativity, and intrinsic motivation, in addition to the content, when the contents were relating to the personality trait of a brand. And then, however, they were less engaged in commenting. And in social media studies, we know that commenting is regarded as the highest level of engagement. However, like share, there is the low level of engagement. So obviously, high level of engagement was not obvious in this study. And therefore, we sort of conclude that based on this study, we can see that there's some degree of the performative nature of authenticity used by the influencers. And this was evidenced by the gap of the content preference between the influencers and followers. So for example, influencers, just now we said, they focus on portraying the physical attributes of the China brand. But for followers, they actually would like to engage with the personality traits of the China brand. So there is a gap in terms of the content preference. And the second is the low frequencies of followers commenting behavior. And then the third is the static interactivity between followers and influencers. So based on these three key findings, we viewed it as some degree of performative nature of authenticity. So as a result, we raised a question, did the influencers in China perform as a state propaganda vehicle, or they try to act as an influential actor that stands for the voice of citizens? So based on just now the findings, we posit that influencers in China actually could retain a certain degree of independence to articulate their self rather than perform on behalf of the government. And this is because they were driven by the common motivation to foster a large and sustainable base of followers through the guise of authenticity. And then because of the hybrid mode of internet censorship and also the social expectation of influencers in promoting core socialist values, the influencers, they have to strategically map the relationship between the government, followers, and the sponsoring brands, if it was available. So these studies unveil the potential of, influencers involving as a crucial form in negotiating political agendas that could represent the voice of citizens. It also gives us a sense of how influencers negotiate their roles to prevent from being influenced to be a state propaganda vehicle, while being in the search of progressing towards an influential actor who stands for the true identity of citizens. So basically, what we found is that the influencers, they try to make a good balance between a state propaganda vehicle, between an influential actor who stands for the voice of citizens. So they try to keep this balance. And therefore, there are some contribution and implication of this research. For example, the theoretical contribution. So this study actually extends the two-way contracts of authenticity, and by developing the linkage with the authentic stakeholder engagement, and from there to further grow influencers' influence. So it extends the two-way contracts of authenticity. In terms of the practical implication, it gives us a sense on what extent the interplay of government and public expectations can mediate the outcome of influencer authenticity. And it also allows us to inform the development of strategies that can utilize authenticity through influencers to engage citizens in promoting or gain public support for a given government-led agenda. So it has this sort of practical implication. And of course, we did this research within the Chinese context, and Chinese influencers have that sort of social expectation from the public. So if we shift the research context, then maybe it will provide a different answer or could reinforce the existing findings. But anyway, so future research will suggest that a kind of diverse context, and then that can further modify this authenticity framework. And to sum up, so we developed this diagram. The influence of influencers is determined by the network of influence co-created with followers, which is dependent on influencers truthfully exercising the authenticity principle in producing value-based contents to engage their followers. And this whole process should be taken into account the socio-political system within which influencers are situated. And the results of this study reinforce the importance to understand and support a more community or public focus orientation to authenticity through engagement between influencers and followers. Finally, I would like to talk a little bit about this research. So it's sort of supported by the 2020 Australian-China Joint Action Program, and then funded by the Academy of the Social Sciences Australia and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And the original form of this presentation is coming from this article that is published in Global Media in China with my former PhD student, Jen Feng. So thank you so much for your presentation, and I welcome to your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Leah.
You're
I'm just
welcome.
waiting for some comments.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for a very insightful presentation. I found it fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the article that you've published with colleagues. And I thought were particularly insightful and interesting were the insights into the social media practices and tactics that social media influencers use in the context of being in China and that governmental system, and the particular dynamics of that are interesting, and how they obviously need to balance particular things, and that applies, I guess, to influences in other countries, but in a different way in a China context. And so it was very insightful. I learned a lot. Now, I can see something in chat, Dr. Leah, so I will see what, well, fascinating presentation. People are echoing what I've just said. It really was.
Thank you.
We are honoured. So, folks, for those of you out there, we do have 5 to 8 minutes left, and would appreciate any questions or comments even that you would like to make, questions that you would like to ask. Anything that you would like Dr. Leah to expand on, perhaps? Okay, so here's one. Could you please expand on the idea of a guise of authenticity? Thanks for that question.
Yes. Very excellent question, Step. So in political study, I think perhaps also in a wider context, the guise of, because it's a dynamic there, social media influencers, their purpose is to grow influence. To grow influence, they need to make sure that keep a good relationships with a diverse range of stakeholders. One of the key stakeholders is their followers. The second key stakeholder could be those relating to some commercial brands. So most of the social media influencers, they actually commodify their fame to gain economic benefits. So as a result, they also need to maintain good relationship with the commercial brands. Now, the third, like in a Chinese context, also government, because of the internet, politics, and culture. So at least there are these 3 different type of key stakeholders that will inform how they shape themselves, present themselves on the internet. So in the end, it seems like which one is the priority for them. So they can't really fully combine with what the government want. They also can't fully combine with what the commercial brands want, because that means they will lose their followers. Followers like to see authentic self and also inspirational ideas rather than those very engineers or artificial kind of presence of themselves. So as a result, what we say is that, well, they have to maintain a certain degree of authenticity and genuine relationship with the audiences. But at the same time, we can't say they fully put 100% efforts to align with the interests of their followers, because there are different type of stakeholders, like their commercial brands and also government. They also have the expectation on them to portray themselves in a particular way. So as a result, we say authenticity is a guide, is have a certain degree of genuine authenticity, but also have a certain degree of performative authenticity. And that perhaps in different contexts is, no matter in China or in different countries, is about the authenticity towards the followers. That could be a very similar approach, but authenticity towards commercial brands and government, that could be varies. So which one plays more influence in terms of how they present themselves is based on the communication ecosystem and internet culture and politics in that context, in that particular cultural context.
That is interesting. I've got another question. It triggers thank you. I like the idea of performative authenticity. I think the word performative is quite insightful there. I'm just going to make a link. It's a little off track, but I think you'll see where I'm coming from. It's outside of the realm of social media, but it's triggering thoughts in my mind about as a teacher of public relations myself, as you are. We talk about at some stages professional identity, and it raises questions about, okay, your values and your true identity, and then how that can come into play in terms of who you may choose to work for and not work for. And no matter who you work for, there are times where we're going to have to be performative in ways that don't necessarily completely, because this is the nature of life. There's no escaping that, the dynamics of that. I guess, Leah, your presentation gives a lot of insight into how people balance and need to go about balancing these things.
So yes, I quite like you just now extend this towards professional identity and organizational identity and perhaps personal identity. So we have so many different identity work as a professional working at particular industry or for particular organization. There are at least three different identities that are there, and perhaps we have social identity there. And I suspect that the best way is that there is a good balance that our personal identity and professional identity is not in clash with organizational identity. If the overlap is bigger, that means it's the best outcome for different stakeholder groups. So what we can do is to minimize the one that disconnect.
Yes, and it's a management type of dynamic working within your construct, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Very much so. So look, we have lots of lovely comments about how people have found the presentation today insightful and enjoyable. So thank you very much. I say to people in our audience, this is recorded. It does take time before it goes onto our Rescom portal, but just to let you know that, and I encourage you to think about having a look at the article published by Leah and her colleagues. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at our next Rescom, the last Friday of July, and we look forward to your company then. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone here, and thank you my colleague in joining this. Thank you for your time, and thank you very much. And feel free to email me if you want further discussion or have further comments about topic relating to this. Thanks.